Good morning, everyone. My name is Kerry Craig, and I am the Capacity Development Manager. And on behalf of Prosperity Indiana, it is our pleasure to have you participate on today's webinar, COVID-19, Making the Case for Housing Security Post-Pandemic. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of our Executive Director, Jessica Love. We want to thank our sponsor for this morning's webinar, Fifth Third Bank, and we want to thank them for allowing us the opportunity to present these COVID webinars over these past 6 to 7 weeks. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jadira Hoptree from Fifth Third Bank, who will also provide a welcome. Jadira?
Good morning and happy Monday, everyone. Hope all the mothers out there had a wonderful Mother's Day celebration, using a little bit of innovation, but still with your family and in health. Thank you again to Prosperity Indiana. Looking at the previous seminars, it is clear that these webinars are a great best practice for the state of Indiana. I personally have learned a lot, and I have received a lot of great feedback from community partners. Also, thank you to the presenters for taking your time to keep us informed, and the participants. Allocating this time is going to help your clients, your neighborhoods, and many, many more people. At Fifth Third, we continue to support, learn, and grow with our communities. Today marks a new beginning for many of us at Fifth Third. As an essential business, we had 50% of our team. We're still working through all the last weeks at the financial centers by appointment only. But today, the rest of us in a smaller group will start reporting to our offices. In addition, we are very excited. We learned late Friday that all the PPP applications presented to the SBA were confirmed, and many loans have already started closing through the weekend. We learned from the SBA that 31,000 business applications were accepted and approved, and this means $5.5 billion in loans and 555,000 jobs potentially impacted. I was closely involved in the Indiana process. It was a lot of hours of work, but happy to learn that many of the businesses, micro businesses, and non-for-profits that presented applications are part of the approval. For those businesses that were not able to apply, let me let you know that we have contributed some funds to lending programs across the Indiana. Please visit the Indiana and the Indiana Chamber Rapid Response Hub to learn more about those programs. Those programs can offer loans starting at $500 all the way to $75,000. So look into those. In addition, through the month of May, as you know, we're celebrating Fifth Third Day, and we are personally celebrating by collecting and donating funds to Feeding America. I alone was able to collect over 25,000 meals this weekend, and I'm very excited about it. Finally, at Fifth Third, we still have open positions for hired, and we continue offering our financial empowerment and workforce development programs free and virtually to all the community organizations. Prosperity Indiana has been so nice to post this on the COVID-19 Hub, and please feel free to reach out to me if you're interested on signing up on in any of these programs or need any assistance. In summary, we are committed. We are really committed to continue supporting inclusive economic mobility. At Fifth Third, we will continue to stay present and responding to the challenges ahead. Again, we are grateful to Prosperity Indiana for leading the way on communication with all of you. Thank you, everybody. Be well. Back to you, Kerry.
Thank you, Jadira. Thank you again to Fifth Third Bank for their generous support. Before we begin this morning, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping items. First, please be aware that all audio is muted. If you'd like to ask a question, there are two ways to do so. You can use the raise hand icon on your screen, and we will unmute your line and you may ask your question or questions. You can always type your question or questions in the Q&A box, which is also located on your screen. We all know that technology could be trying these days, especially while working from home. So if you lose your connection, you may also reconnect using the link emailed to you. And finally, we will post today's presentation and recording on our COVID-19 Resources Hub, which is located at on our website at www.prosperityindiana.org. And now I wish to turn it over to Andrew Bradley, who will be our moderator for today's session. Andrew?
Thank you so much, Carrie. And while you can see our executive director's picture there, that was Jessica. And thank you, Jadira, so much for your sponsorship of these webinars. This has been a really important resource, and I'm glad we're able to bring it to everyone today. My name is Andrew Bradley. I'm Policy Director at Prosperity Indiana. And I'm glad that we have this opportunity to talk about this critical issue, because housing security has been something that's been on our minds since before the pandemic began, and it's taken on a new urgency and a new light in the face of that pandemic. So the conversation that we're going to be able to have today, we're able to bring you experts from the national, state, and local perspectives, and different perspectives from each of those levels, to be able to talk about what would housing security look like post-pandemic. But I'll preface this conversation by saying that in order to get to housing security in the long term, we're also going to need to address it in an effective way in the short and medium term as well. And I think that you'll get a sense for that from the different speakers that we have today. So without any further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Mr. Brandon Beeler. Brandon is the Director of Housing Law Center at the Indiana Legal Services, Inc., where he represents low-income clients in rental housing matters, as well as identifies and litigates in statewide systemic issues related to Hoosier renters. So Brandon, we're really interested to hear what ILS is doing in the housing security arena regarding the COVID crisis and response.
Oh, great. Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you to Prosperity Indiana for having us be a part of this very important conversation. We're really excited to be here today. And so I'm just going to kind of start off with, you know, where Indiana Legal Services is, what we're doing, and kind of what we can do in this. So kind of jumping right in, and let me just kind of explain what Indiana Legal Services is. We are a statewide nonprofit law firm. We receive a majority of our funds from the Legal Services Corporation, which does limit our ability to like lobby or actually work directly on policy work. However, we do focus on providing comments when asked by different community groups regarding policies or regulations that may have a direct impact on the clients we see. We do provide free legal services to all qualifying clients, which means that they have to be below a certain level of the national poverty guidelines. And we also work to inform tenants and the community in general of different issues and their rights. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, legal services organizations operated under pretty limited resources, as I think we all do in this area. But we really do try to provide as many direct and extended services to eligible clients as possible. However, we are aware that we just can't, and we won't be able to help everybody. So that's why educating the public is a really important part of what we try to do. And hopefully we can provide some folks tools to help maybe represent and advocate for themselves if they have to do that. We are currently, throughout this crisis, we've been constantly updating our website. We put new information on there as soon as we're able to get it, and as it becomes available. And we also are trying to put out some general legal information on our social media platforms as well. And on that note, I just kind of want to maybe set the stage and take a second to give everyone a quick, brief snapshot of where evictions are, at least the state of evictions are in Indiana, and a brief note on what federally where they are. I know many of you probably are aware or have heard this before, but it's just, I think it's just really important for either those who haven't heard or just to kind of get some of these principles and where we are and what rights tenants have in the COVID crisis, just re-solidified and solidified in your minds as you talk to the folks that you all help. So really quickly, in Indiana, we're currently, Indiana Legal Services, we're kind of calling it an eviction pause because moratorium can be a little bit confusing to non-legalese speakers of what that means. And a pause is probably a better way to think about it and a more easy way to think about it, because during this time, a tenant could do something, which I'll get into, that could cause it to be a lease violation and therefore qualify for potentially an eviction filing later down the line. So so basically all the obligations that a tenant has, including paying rent, is still expected during this time. So here in Indiana, on March 19th is when Governor Holcomb issued the executive order that put the moratorium or put the pause on evictions. As of May 1st, the eviction moratorium has been extended through June 4th, 2020. I'm going to quickly just read Governor Holcomb's language when he introduced this. I think it's important, and while it's not actually in the text of the order itself, I think it's important to think about it from the way how he described it. And what he said was that no residential eviction proceedings or foreclosure actions may be initiated during the public health emergency. The order itself specifically says it is reasonable and necessary to suspend laws relating to real property, including breach of leases and mortgages, to control the occupancy of premises in the disaster area, which is the entire state of Indiana, and to impose a moratorium on both evictions and foreclosures. So it is pretty strong language that we seek and we continue to make sure is enforced. Just to be clear on that, again, tenants are obligated during this time to continue paying rent. And pivoting now to the federal eviction moratorium. This is the main one is actually under the CARES Act, which was passed on March 27th. And just to kind of give you a brief, a brief snapshot of what this is there are certain covered properties that this is covered under. And the covered properties, the list is quite exhaustive, but to be very brief about it, it covers most federally subsidized properties. So the ones that everyone kind of knows and is probably familiar with: the public housing program, the Section 8 housing choice voucher program, project-based Section 8, the low-income tax credit program, also known as Section 42, HUD-VASH. All these, the more popular programs are the ones, I guess, that people have more familiarity on, are covered. Additionally, rural housing and rural vouchers are also covered under the CARES Act protections. And what they basically are is that no eviction it extends for 120 days. So there's a moratorium until July 25th, 2020. And it restricts landlords or owners from filing new eviction actions that are based on non-payment of rent. In addition, it prohibits charging any late fees, penalties, or any other charges that are related to non-payment of rent. And finally, there's also a notice requirement. So if a tenant in a federally subsidized covered property is in fact delinquent or behind on their rent, first of all, the landlord or the owner cannot even issue the notice until July 25th. And it's important to know that because the notice is critical. So come July 25th, if a landlord or owners do want to evict folks, they're going to have to, based on non-payment of rent, they are going to have to file or give the tenant a 30-day notice first. Failure to do that should be an automatic dismissal of any eviction claim. So that's just a brief snapshot. And again, I know, that's probably has been beaten to death to a lot of people, but I just think it's important again to educate, just so people know where we are. What we're doing now, and I kind of summarized this into three things, and I just did some digging over the weekend just to see what our office is seeing here on the ground. The first thing we're seeing a lot of are issues that are dealing with hotels and motels. This is one of the first things we actually saw back even before or right, I guess, when the eviction moratorium and pause occurred. The issue is essentially that under the Landlord-Tenant Code in Indiana, hotels and motels are not covered under the protections of the Landlord-Tenant statute. In other words, folks who reside in hotels and motels, even extended stay ones, are not entitled to due process, meaning that they don't have to actually be evicted. They can actually just be removed from the room. Obviously, there's a lot of policy implications that we found problematic with that, especially kicking folks out in the middle of a global pandemic. And some help that we got with that actually is in the governor's, when Governor Holcomb issued his stay-at-home order, because in that order, he, and it's Executive Order 2008 for anyone who's interested, he actually lists that hotels and motels are included as housing or houses for the stay-at-home order. Fortunately, from what I've seen, we've been able to informally resolve issues when we've had folks call our office about this issue, about potentially being kicked out of their hotel room. But we are prepared based on not only that guidance from the governor's executive order, but also just, again, the general policy reason of kicking people out of any sort of housing during a pandemic. So that's what we're kind of keeping an eye on that, and we are preparing to, if we need to litigate that in some way, we will. The other issue we're dealing with is previously ordered writs and evictions. Some of these also include some that were filed prior to March 19th and whether courts are going to start scheduling them. We, again, believe the spirit and the language of the order is clear that no eviction action or no eviction case should be heard before June 4th, and also that no writ should be executed before June 4th. So we also, and again, we're also looking at the Indiana Supreme Court guidelines of courts being closed. The final issue we're seeing a lot of, and this really started emerging in mid-April, was what we call self-help eviction. And really what that is, that's when the owner or the landlord takes some sort of action, or I guess fails to take some sort of action that maybe renders a property really uninhabitable, maybe turns off the water, turns off the heating or air, or does something more even direct, such as locking a tenant out and changing the locks when the tenants are away. It's worth noting that's never been allowed in Indiana. That's not allowed, and obviously certainly not allowed now. The issue, again, has been popping up more and more recently. Perhaps owners are getting more frustrated, but again, that is not permitted under the law. I currently have a few active situations right now, so unfortunately I can't speak too in depth about those in particular, but what I want to say to this group, and obviously I'm happy to follow up with anyone else, and especially our community partners here, we plan to resource share as we learn what is successful in that sort of advocacy, and frankly what might be unsuccessful. We may have some unsuccessful strategies that we'd also like to share just to kind of help people avoid some pitfalls. And if we're able to provide like pro se pleadings, meaning like template documents that tenants can use themselves if they don't qualify for our services or don't want to use a lawyer for some reason, we're going to try to make that information and those pleadings available as well. And finally, going to the future and planning for the future, I think it's no secret our biggest concern is the surge of eviction filings come June 4th and or come July 25th. Again, we're limited as an LSC organization to really get involved in policy work, but we've really, hopefully have tried to step up and provide information to our partners, including groups like Prosperity Indiana, the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana, and as you guys will hear in a few minutes, the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition that are really taking the lead in directing and trying to get some good policy out there and getting these resources that are frankly in a lot of ways more important than legal resources, such as a rental assistance fund and things like that that would really benefit and help the clients that we see. And with that, I guess I'm going to skip over the last part. And the only thing I'm going to say, just for folks in Indiana, I want to just leave you with a few resources if I don't get a chance to say these today later today. But here in Marion County, there are two programs and initiatives that are kind of kicking off. The Eviction Avoidance Project, actually, that's been around for about 2 years now. That's run out of our office by an attorney named Michael Hurst. That, again, is limited to Marion County residents, but it takes a right to counsel approach that was, that you may be familiar with, that was adopted in New York City to just, even for tenants that we would say maybe don't have the best facts, they're at least going to be vetted and given advice and representation by an attorney. The TLAP, the Tenant Legal Assistance Project, that is going to launch later in this month, and that's going to be a tenant help desk for tenants who have questions and want some legal advice, and that's being helped staffed, I guess, by pro bono attorneys in the private bar. Again, we encourage you to call our office or any other legal aid organizations or direct tenants to call them. And finally, the last is the Indiana Attorney General has a specific consumer complaint for landlords that are even threatening eviction. So even if they've not taken an action, but they're telling the tenant, hey, I'm turning your power off next week, we really encourage folks to fill out one of those consumer complaint forms with the Attorney General's office. And with that, I will conclude my initial statements. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Brandon, for kind of setting the legal landscape and telling us the state of play in terms of the governor's eviction pause and moratorium. And I think we're going to hear this echoed throughout the rest of the conversation, but there's a lot to do for us to prepare for that June 4th deadline when that's planned to be lifted. And I wanted to check in and give Carrie a chance to see if we've had any questions submitted. If anybody has specific questions for Brandon now, feel free to raise your hand or type those in. The way that we've planned out the rest of this discussion is we want to give each of the speakers an opportunity to talk about their specific perspective and issue and allow for questions specifically to that speaker. But we've also reserved some time at the end for a broader discussion about housing security and advocacy. As Brandon mentioned, ILS is there's some guardrails in terms of some of the advocacy work that they do. But if you have any specific questions for him, feel free to put those in now or save them for the end, and we're happy to have a broader discussion. So Carrie, do we have any questions for Brandon at this point?
There are some questions. So for the CARES Act, does this, let's see, so for the CARES Act, does this include the regular landlords, also privately owned homes that are rented out?
No, I don't believe so. The CARES Act covers just the covered properties, which are mostly, again, federally subsidized properties. There is an additional federal moratorium on properties that have federal mortgages. So you may want to look into, there's another database for that. But if it's a private landlord-tenant situation, that's really just covered by the Indiana eviction pause.
A second question is, are landlords able to attach late fees on a tenant's account due to non-payment of rent during the EO moratorium?
Well, I think that means executive order. So for a private, in private landlord-tenant settings, yes, the lease governs. We would encourage owners to work with tenants to understand the financial limitations at this time, but the prohibition on attaching late fees attaches specifically just to the properties covered under the CARES Act. So again, the late fee prohibition is specific to federally subsidized property.
Okay. Is it okay to send the notice of eviction prior to these dates, meaning we will not evict until after the dates as outlined? If the eviction issue is for violation of lease, such as violence towards other tenants, and an ongoing issue that has come to a head, as well as allowing those that are not on lease to live in the low-income senior housing apartment?
Oh, that's a complicated question, but yeah, I mean, and I obviously I respect the owner and understand that that's a challenging situation that you're in right now. If other tenants in your community are maybe feeling threatened, obviously you have legal remedies with police and things like that. I would say, I guess, to be safe, and our position here is, again, the governor's language, which is why I read it, specific to the Indiana state pause, was that no eviction can be initiated. So yeah, sending a letter could be considered initiating an eviction. And then if it is a federally subsidized property, the CARES Act's pretty clear that no notice can be sent until July 25th, which is the 120 days for the moratorium. That's our understanding.
And then finally, what about the Supreme Court directive that directs the courts to continue to accept eviction filings?
Well, I mean, filings can still be accepted. I mean, I think that, and then I didn't want to get too into the weeds with that, because, really that's also looked at by county perspective. Each county court in Indiana has filed its own emergency procedures as to how they will operate. I think that I guess I can't go through without knowing more. I don't want to talk too hypothetically. I would advise not to file during this time, just because there's the other side is, again, that would certainly be an initiation of an eviction. So, I don't know. I guess I would advise, again, trying to not do that if you're an owner. I understand there are complications. I understand there are certainly other perspectives and things to think about, but I would advise that not filing is probably the best thing to be compliant with the orders, both the state and federal at this time.
Great, thank you, Brandon. That's all of the questions now, Andrew.
Thank you, Carrie, and thanks again, Brandon. So next up, we have Elspeth L.B. Hilton, who's the Director of Community Services at the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority, or IHCDA. Her division oversees several funding sources aimed at ending and preventing homelessness. In her role, she oversees the division's strategy, partnerships, and staff to help make homelessness a brief experience for less and less people. So with that, let me turn it over to Elby. Thank you so much for joining us, and I think our audience is really excited to hear what IHCDA and the state has been working on and what they have coming up.
Wonderful, thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm Elby Hilton. I'm the Director of Community Services, like Andrew mentioned. IHCDA is the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority, and many of you probably interact with us in a variety of different ways. What we like to say is that we help Hoosiers with housing and community development work, from homelessness to home ownership. So we are a state agency, but we are quasi-governmental, so we're a little bit more we can move a little more quickly than other state agencies because of that flexibility. Our division, Community Services, again, is there to help with funding and resources to prevent and end homelessness across the balance of state in Indiana. So how that manifests itself is two different divisions. We have our grants team, and there's 4 main grants that we oversee and administer across the state. Those are the Continuum of Care grants, the Emergency Solution grants, some TANF funding, and the Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS. All of these grant sources are federal, except for the TANF funding, and they revolve around rental assistance to either prevent someone from going into homelessness or end someone's chronic homelessness. So we run that kind of gamut of rental assistance. There's also funding for supportive services with these dollars that are those wraparound services. Additionally, we have some funding for outreach to reach those experiencing homelessness, and to help with operational dollars for shelters. On the other side of our team, we have the Hmis team, which is the Homeless Management Information System. And that system, essentially any organization who receives our federal dollars has to put their client level data into that system. That means that we have a lot of data on what homelessness looks like in Indiana. We report up to HUD annually, several times throughout the year, actually, with data around homelessness in the state. And we also conduct the point in time count. So those may have been ways you interacted with our team. Our biggest program is that Continuum of Care program, and it really guides a lot of what we do in our division. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the COC, it's a program through HUD where essentially HUD said, it's not one person or one entity who can end homelessness in a given service area. It has to be that we all come together, lots of different types of organizations, homeless assistance providers, the medical community, the mental health community. They all have to come together in our service area to discuss how we prevent and end homelessness together. And with that comes the rental assistance funding that I mentioned at the top. It also promotes self-sufficiency for individuals experiencing homelessness, and it also promotes some best practices. With that funding, we're considered the collaborative applicant with the balance of state COC. So in Indiana, we have 2 COCs. One is in Marion County, and we partner at IHCDA with the balance of state COC. And that means we partner with a board of directors. And it also means that we've broken up the state into 16 regions. And those regions are, they each have their own contact in that area. They're comprised of several different counties that are looped in together. And those are the people that are the boots on the ground. And they're working together. They meet monthly or quarterly, depending on the region. And they talk about how they're going to end homelessness in their area or prevent it. That information is then filtered up to our board of directors, and they create strategy and guidance for us at IHCDA, and then we implement those with policies and procedures out to the field. So that's kind of generally how we work with the field, how we work with individuals experiencing homelessness. Again, we're indirectly involved with that population, but we support them through funding and resources. With the COVID-19 pandemic, we have had some involvement in the response to that for our regions and for our COC. We've also partnered with the Marion County COC in several ways. But our initial response, we got some guidance from the board of directors, and that information is available on IHCDA's website. So it has guidance on what you should do, how you should shelter in place at an organization that is housing individuals or supporting individuals experiencing homelessness. We also have had weekly calls with our regions and our leads who are assessing people's vulnerability. We gave out some funding as IHCDA to help in the response for COVID-19 and have partnered with FSSA they're funding some isolation shelters, one in each of our regions. Some regions are paired together if they're smaller, but by and large, we have tried to have an isolation shelter or option available for an individual who is experiencing homelessness, who has symptoms or test positive to COVID-19. And those have manifested themselves in several ways. Some of them are hotel rooms or full hotels that the region is renting out. In some cases, it's schools that they don't have children right now, and in other cases, it's an actual standalone building. And we have a list of those on our website as well, if you're interested in that. We recognize right now people are thinking about, okay, how do we move ahead? What's some guidance and next steps? So one of the things I'm working on this week is getting together some information on how folks can move forward, knowing the governor's guidance around moving ahead, and then more long-term assistance. So what we've heard from the field is that rental assistance is going to be a large need once the eviction moratorium is ends, and we also recognize there's probably going to be an increase in homelessness across the state just due to the fact that many people have been affected negatively by this pandemic. So with that, we did receive some CARES Act dollars that we're working through right now. Those are mostly for our team, that's ESG and HOPWA dollars that we have received, and all of those are, I'd say 80% of those funds were going to go towards rental assistance to help prevent homelessness and for someone who is affected by COVID-19. Across the agency, we also have some additional CARES Act dollars with our community programs team and then the real estate team. So we have on IHCDA's website a COVID-19 specific page, which gives all the updates on our different divisions and departments. So if you're working with someone in a different area, we can, they should have some information there, or I can assist in connecting you. And the last thing I'll note is that with that CARES Act funding, we have to have public comments and a public hearing, and that should be scheduled within the next, you should see that updated probably this week. So we welcome any comments or suggestions you have for those funds. And I think that sort of wraps up my updates. Is there anything I missed, Andrew or Carrie?
Well, I'd like to be, thanks First of all, LB, for that update, I think that that provides a good description of some of the processes behind the curtain, as it will, at IHCDA for some of our audience who aren't aware of some of the nuts and bolts programs. I'd be interested, Carrie, if there's any questions that we have to begin with.
Yes, there are. The first question is, what is happening with ESG? When will the new ESG application be available, and when will any additional CARES funding be distributed?
That's a great question. So we're calling it normal ESG. So what you would normally receive during the program year, we have pushed back the application process. That's getting publicized, I think this week or next. If you don't see that update within the week, you can email me and I can connect you with Diane on our team who runs ESG. So that's one update there. With the CARES Act funding, we have to go through an amendment process and a public hearing process for those dollars, just like we do for our normal consolidated plan. So with that, we will do the public hearing. More than likely, it'll be next week. And we submit our amendments sometime today. So I'm thinking within the next month, we will have an update on the CARES Act funding. Again, it's more long-term assistance, or not long-term, it's more recovery assistance. So we're trying to make sure that we get all the steps correct before we release that funding. But if you have questions or want to have an immediate update, you can email me and I can help you out with that.
So a few more questions here. Regarding grant eligibility, are people who have applied for legal asylum status eligible to apply for these grants?
So for our funding, it's mostly an organization like a nonprofit or a government entity that applies for our funds. So it would not be an individual. If you're talking about getting assistance through an organization, I'd have to check into that. So I can follow up with some additional information.
Very good, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
One listeners mentioned that they missed what COC stood for.
Sure, that stands for Continuum of Care, and it's a little bit confusing because it is both the name of the funding and the name of the program and the name of the actual entity that we partner with. So COC is a program through HUD called Continuum of Care. Because through that program, we're supposed to have a board that oversees our geographic Continuum of Care service area. So for us, that's every county but Marion. And it's also, COC also is the funding, the rental assistance that ties to that program.
Another great question we have is, are your grants designed for folks who have been medically diagnosed with COVID-19, or does this include those who have lost their jobs due to the pandemic?
That's a good question. So what we're working through right now in our amendment is clarification on that. And through the public hearing process, we'd love to hear what would be most helpful for you all.
And finally, are there regions in the state you anticipate to have higher rates of homelessness? Great question.
Yeah, I would say probably the areas most affected by COVID-19, we would anticipate would have a higher level of homelessness. It's hard to say right now. So one of the things we're doing with the CARES Act dollars is overlaying where we have seen need for ESG dollars in the past and where the hardest hit areas of COVID-19 have been. So Lake, Cass County, and Marion have been highly affected, as you all know, and trying to push out funds to those areas based on need. We're also looking at how can we be aware of those of the, let's see, what am I trying to say here? Different populations that may have been affected. So making sure that demographics are taken into account and that we reach minority populations and those who may be missed in this process.
Thank you, LB. That concludes all of our questions, Andrew.
Wonderful. I have to step off. So if there's any questions later on, I'm happy to take them in email if that's okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, LB. And again, I think for the conversation that we will have later throughout this call, the information you provided will be of great assistance. And I'm again, thanks for your partnership through IHCDA, and I know we'll be continuing to work with you in the future. So thanks, LB. And just a short housekeeping note, you may have noticed that we're at 43 after of the hour. We scheduled this call from 10 to 11, but there's nothing saying that we have to end right at 11. And I think, frankly, at this point, that we likely will be going over. So just a heads up, I want to make sure that our presenters know that we're likely to continue this conversation past the hour, and we'll see if we want to go for an additional 15 minutes or half an hour. We have that ability. So next up, I'm pleased to be able to introduce Diane Yantel, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. NLIHC is a membership organization dedicated solely to achieving socially just public policy that ensures people with the lowest incomes in the United States have affordable and decent homes. Diane is a policy expert and advocate with nearly 2 decades of experience on affordable housing and community development issues. Among other roles, she previously served as Vice President of Public Policy and Government Affairs at Enterprise Community Partners and Director of the Public Housing Management and Occupancy Division at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So Diane, we have your slides, and I believe Carrie will be advancing those. Thank you and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me, and good morning. Yes, so I wanted to share the national perspective of both the housing crisis, how COVID-19 is impacting it, and what the solutions are and what all you can do to engage in some of the solutions. I did want to first just very briefly, if I can, mention something related to Brandon's comments, which were very good, and related to the federal moratoriums on evictions. As he said, the CARES Act does have a number of federal eviction moratoriums, some related to all federally subsidized properties, including low-income housing tax credits, and also all properties, rental properties that have mortgages that are backed by the federal government. And it can be very difficult for renters or their advocates or their attorneys to know which properties are covered under the federal moratoriums. So we do have a database that we created that's on our website at nlihc.org. It's a searchable database of most rental units that are covered under the federal eviction moratorium. So somebody can go in, type in their address, and find out whether their property is covered and whether they are protected by an eviction moratorium. So I just wanted to encourage people to check that out. So of course, before COVID-19 ever even came to our country, we had a homelessness and housing crisis across the country. We had over 550,000 people experiencing homelessness, and those numbers have been increasing for the last 3 years. And of course, this homelessness is primarily a result of rising housing costs, and for the lowest income people, stagnant wages. And even before COVID-19, we had a shortage of 7 million homes affordable and available to the lowest income renters. So another way of saying that same number is what you see on your screen right now, which is for every 100 of the lowest income renters, nationally, there's just 37 homes that are affordable and available to them. And in Indiana, it's just slightly better than that. For every 100 of the lowest income renters, there are just 38 homes affordable and available to them. And the shortage ranges from most severe to least severe, but there is no state, there is no major metropolitan area in the country that has a sufficient number of homes affordable to its lowest income renters. And so this shortage leaves millions of people, of renters, right on the cusp of homelessness. And again, before COVID-19, we had about 8 million of the lowest income renters who were paying over half of their income to keep a roof over their heads. So they're paying, when you have such limited income to begin with, and you're paying 50, 60, 70% of it towards rent, you are always just one financial shock away from not being able to pay the rent and facing possible eviction and potentially, in worst cases, homelessness. So next slide, please. So for many of these renters, of course, the coronavirus is that financial shock. We've seen, and you all know, these really shocking levels of jobs and wages that are being lost from the financial fallout of closing down cities to contain the pandemic. This will increase, of course, the number of people who are struggling to pay their rent. It will also increase the number of people who become extremely low income or very low income renters. We did an analysis, a conservative analysis based on what happened in our last recession, and are estimating that as a result of this one, we will have at least 1.5 million households have their incomes drop them down to a level where they are now very low or extremely low income. And so we will have even more competition for those same very limited number of homes that are affordable to them. Next slide, please. So if we had a system in our country to catch people when they fall off of a financial cliff created by any disaster, but especially a disaster like COVID-19, we could better weather these challenges, but of course we don't. We have a system in our country where only 1 in every 4 households who needs housing assistance and is eligible for it receives any. So 75% of low-income families who need housing assistance and are eligible get none. They are the folks who wait in line hoping to win what is essentially a housing lottery system in our country, where only 25% get the help that they need. So now we're left to ask ourselves this question, right? What happens when millions of people are on the cusp of losing their homes in the middle of a pandemic, when our collective health depends on our ability to stay home? And I think one result, maybe, I hope, is that we all better understand professionally and personally that housing is healthcare, right? And I think whether or not we understand that, it's clear that we will not contain the pandemic until everyone is able to stay stably housed during it. Next slide, please. And I think it's always important to take a moment to remind ourselves that this pandemic is not the great equalizer, as some have said. And in fact, this moment is an example of what structural racism looks like, right? Structural racism results in people of color being disproportionately harmed by this disaster and by all disasters. Structural racism results in people of color being disproportionately low income, disproportionately rent burdened. Black and Native people are disproportionately homeless, and Black and Native people are disproportionately dying from COVID-19. Next slide, please. And extremely low income renters and very low income renters are disproportionately people of color as well. And the higher up the income ladder we go, the whiter renters are, which tells us that if we are to center racial equity in the response, which really we have an obligation to do, we know where we need to direct those limited resources, right? We need to direct them towards the lowest income renters who have the greatest and the clearest needs and who are more likely to be people of color. So we have an obligation, I believe, as we design and we implement the solutions, to ensure not only that we're not reinforcing or worsening racial inequities, but that we're using all of these new housing and homelessness funds to reverse and to correct the disparities. Next slide, please. So the solutions are somewhat obvious, as they always have been, right? The solutions to ending homelessness and ending housing poverty, and even now during COVID-19, right? We need to protect and house people who are homeless. We need to prevent more people from becoming homeless, and we need to preserve affordable housing. Next slide, please. And in the CARES Act, which you've heard spoken about quite a bit on this webinar, there are substantial new resources and protections for low-income renters and for people who are homeless. And they come in the form of the limited federal eviction moratoriums and foreclosure moratoriums, and in the $12 billion that were appropriated for housing and homelessness purposes. And that was a tremendous step forward. It was a big achievement, and it's not nearly enough. We know that we need much more. And one of the things we need to ensure that we have, and one of NLIGC's top priorities, is to get a uniform national moratorium on evictions. and foreclosures so that all of us are assured that we won't lose our homes in the middle of a public health emergency. But those eviction moratoriums aren't enough. We know that eventually those moratoriums will be lifted, and we don't want to create a financial cliff for renters to fall off of at that time when back rent is owed and they don't have an ability to pay. And we also know that if renters aren't able to pay their rent, small landlords will be really challenged because they rely on rental income to continue to operate and maintain their properties. So we don't want to end the crisis having saddled more low-income renters with debt or having lost any of our country's really essential affordable housing stock. So we need a substantial amount of emergency rental assistance. And at the Coalition, we put out a paper, a research note a couple of months ago that we also updated then on Friday to project what it would cost in emergency rental assistance to keep people stably housed during and after the pandemic. And depending on how you slice it, depending on who's protected and for how long, it would cost really no less than $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. And so that's what we have been calling for since that time. Next slide, please. And we now have legislation that was introduced just on Friday, formally introduced in the House, and will be formally introduced in the Senate today. And it is the Emergency Rental Assistance and Rental Market Stabilization Act. It was introduced by Senator Sherrod Brown in the Senate, along with 26 Senate original co-sponsors. And in the House, it was introduced by Representative Maxine Waters and Representative Denny Heck, along with 135 original co-sponsors in the House. So really some tremendous support from the start when this legislation was introduced. And it would provide $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. The funding could be used pretty flexibly. It could provide families with short and medium-term rental assistance for up to 24 months. It could cover up to 6 months of back rent, late fees, utility costs in some cases, security deposits in some cases. Next slide, please. And the funds would go initially, the first half of the funds, so if we achieve it all, $50 billion within 7 days, would go out using existing homeless assistance grants funding formula, so 2 states and localities. And the rest of it would go out under a new formula that's created to really to be responsive to existing needs. All of the money would essentially go to states and localities who could then subgrant and should subgrant the funds to local service providers, to public housing agencies, to state housing finance agencies, and others who could distribute the funds. Next slide, please. I just said this, the state and local governments can partner with the PHAs, and any funds that aren't expended after 3 years, which I doubt there would be, but if there are, there's a fail-safe in the bill to make sure that those funds remain in affordable housing. And so those funds would be invested in the National Housing Trust Fund and the Capital Magnet Fund. Next slide, please. So it's an incredibly important bill, and it's a very important moment. So the $12 billion that we were able to achieve in the CARES Act the first time around was at a time when there was broad agreement in the House and the Senate by Republicans and Democrats that we needed big spending very quickly to respond to the crisis. That moment is over. And now there is a lot more reluctance from both some Republicans and some moderate Democrats, reluctance to spend more money, questions about how to spend the money, when it might be needed. You know, this moment of shared urgency is starting to pass. But the needs are greater than ever and more clear than ever. So it will take much more of a coordinated and concerted effort to achieve this emergency rental assistance that we know we need. Your delegation in Indiana has so far not signed on to either the House or the Senate bills. So I really want to encourage everybody to call your member of Congress and urge them to co-sponsor these bills. Senator Young will be especially important. Certainly he has been a leader on affordable housing over the last couple of years, thanks to the work that many of you have been doing to educate him and work with him. It would be tremendously helpful if he would agree to the need for this bill, whether as a formal co-sponsor on the bill or by relaying to the leadership in the Senate that this bill is important to him and emergency rental assistance is important to him. So you have a very important job to do to get your delegation on board with this rental assistance bill. And that's just the first step. The next step, of course, will be sometime this week in the House of Representatives. Speaker Nancy Pelosi will put out her proposal for the beginning of the negotiations. And it's just so important that we have this bill be part of that package. So that's our focus for this week. And then, of course, the negotiations begin between the House and the Senate. And we will need to be very active in calling for this emergency rental assistance. And again, this is one of 3 priorities that we are pushing for in the CARES 2 Act, the $100 billion for emergency rental assistance, a national moratorium on all evictions and foreclosures, and an additional $11.5 billion for homeless shelter providers and service providers to meet existing needs. I think that's my last slide. Is there one more slide? I can't remember.
I think that's the last one that you gave us.
I think that's the last one. Okay, so I'll stop there. Just urge you all to please call, tweet, and contact your members of Congress about this really important bill. And I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions.
And Carrie, I know that Diane has to, will have to leave the call in a minute, but if there were any specific questions for her, I did want to give a chance for her to address those.
At this moment, there are no questions, Andrew.
Okay. So thanks again, Diane. A very important national perspective. We will actually be following up in just a minute with a little bit more state level detail and a state level call to action. But I think this helps to underline why it's so important for Indiana's congressional delegation to not just support, but to help champion this effort for this new rental assistance program, because there's not going to be, we're not going to be able to get done nearly what we need to at the state level without that federal support. Okay.
I do have one question, Andrew. Can any of the emergency funds be used towards adding to the affordable housing inventory?
That's a great question. No, at this time, the focus is on keeping people housed in the units that they're in and providing the rental assistance needed to do that, or getting people out of homeless shelters and out of homeless encampments and into housing. It's a great point, though. That's certainly, I mean, the map that I showed earlier on, and all of you know very well that there's a tremendous need for additional funding to build affordable housing across the country. I do believe it's likely that at some point Congress will turn to a bill to stimulate the economy and some type of big stimulus package. When they do, whenever there has been big stimulus packages in the past, housing is a big component of that, because of course constructing affordable housing creates jobs, it creates tax revenue, there's all sorts of benefits for the community in addition to those hard units that house low-income people. So when Congress is ready to turn to a stimulus package or an infrastructure package, we are ready to strongly advocate for increased investments in the National Housing Trust Fund, in deeply targeted low-income housing tax credits, and other ways to produce and to preserve affordable housing. So also funding to repair public housing across the country will be really important. I will say the closer it gets to the elections, the harder it becomes for Congress to pass that kind of a stimulus package. But it's possible, and it's also possible that it could be the kind of thing that could pass in the final days of this legislative session after an election. So we certainly have that in mind and have it on our priority list for when the time is right.
We have a second question here that says, can you please share or explain the potential request for $11 billion for shelters? What is the proposal and to whom?
Sure. So early on, when we were advocating under the initial CARES Act, we, together with the National Alliance to End Homelessness, worked with some researchers out of University of Pennsylvania. Dennis Culhane was one who has done a lot of research on homelessness over the years. They did an estimate of what it would cost, first, just how many people who are experiencing homelessness are at risk of the disease and of potentially getting very sick or dying from the disease, and what it would cost to implement social distancing procedures within shelters to keep people alive and keep them safe during the pandemic. And the estimate that they came up with was that it would cost a total of $15.5 billion just to be able to keep the existing homeless population safe and socially distanced during the pandemic. So we were able to achieve $4 billion in ESG grants in the CARES Act. So that leaves about $11 billion more that's needed. Some of those funds are being found from FEMA, because FEMA, through its disaster relief funds, is in some states paying for non-congregate shelter for people who are experiencing homelessness. So where the states are moving people who are homeless out of shelters, off of the streets, into hotels, FEMA is paying for that in some cases. But FEMA has been doing it in a very limited way, and not all states, including the state of Indiana, are asking FEMA to pay for it in that way. So there's still a lot of money that's necessary, again, for all of the kind of social distancing required to keep people safe. So putting people into hotels, the services and the staffing needed to do that, or implementing social distancing within existing shelter systems. That's what the additional funds would be used for.
And that includes all of the questions.
Okay, well, thanks again, Diane, for joining this call. Next, we have two more speakers who are listed. They are both members of this new Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition that has been formed to help respond at a state level, but also to help encourage coordination of federal, state, and local community resources. So as I turn to Amy and Dee here in a moment, I do want to note that we're over our original hour. I want to make sure that we give them both an opportunity to describe the work that they're doing, and I asked them coming into this to help describe why they wanted to get involved in the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition. So I'm going to turn to Amy and Dee, and then we'll follow up with I have a few slides prepared on the recommendations that coalition has formed. So let me next turn to Amy Nelson, Executive Director of the Fair Housing Center at Central Indiana. The mission of the center is to ensure equal housing opportunities by eliminating housing discrimination through advocacy, enforcement, education, and outreach. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you, Andrew. So to give just some quick additional background about the Fair Housing Center, and then I'll review some of the issues that we have been hearing about, some of which have already been discussed, and then do a quick background about the new coalition. So the Fair Housing Center Central Indiana is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. As Andrew mentioned, our mission is ensuring equal housing opportunities. We do that throughout 24 counties within Central Indiana. Now, it's important to note that the Fair Housing Center is the only nonprofit fair housing organization in all of Indiana, which is actually unique. The states around us have several organizations. For instance, Ohio, I believe, has 8 groups, Michigan has 6, and Illinois has 7. And we're it in Indiana. So because of that, sometimes we do venture outside of Central Indiana when our resources allow us to do such. And we have 4 main programs. One is our advocacy program. That is where we assist victims of housing discrimination, determining if what occurred to them is a violation of fair housing law. And then we also conduct systemic-based investigations and move forward with enforcement actions if we find violations of law are occurring. We also have an education program where we do a number of trainings throughout the year, our Inclusive Communities program, and then our Public Policy program, which will lead into our discussion about the coalition. So what is the Fair Housing Center hearing in this current COVID-19 world? Brandon discussed a number of the same issues that we are hearing. I think it's important to point out that the Fair Housing Center, we specifically work on fair housing violations. So if somebody is simply having a landlord-tenant dispute, those we would refer to one of our legal services partners to try to get assistance, or to private legal counsel to get an answer. So there has to be some allegation of violation of fair housing laws for us to go forward in initiating an investigation and moving forward. So the landlord-tenant issues we've been hearing that we've been referring to our legal services partners are simply people worrying about how they are going to pay their rent. They've had job loss, unemployment either hasn't kicked in or they hadn't gotten their stimulus check, or it's not going to be sufficient, that stimulus check, in allowing people to be able to pay their rent, which is now going on 2 months and likely to be 3 months where rent has been due and they've been out of job loss. As was raised with Brandon earlier, issues about whether or not late fees can be charged. We've gotten those inquiries. Concerns about utility turnoffs. We have also gotten those calls into our office where instead of going through the eviction process, which is of course under a moratorium right now, landlords have been turning off utilities to try to get somebody out, which as Brandon mentioned is illegal any time of the year to do that. And then specifically for us, some fair housing based issues that have come up. One is issues at the national level. We've had some minimal calls here on it, but issues around discrimination against Asians. And then an area that we have had some contacts about is issues around sexual harassment, solicitation for sex in exchange for rent payments, for instance, or to not be evicted. We have had that come up here in Indiana and are investigating those allegations. And then something that we are promoting is Section 8 to ensure this is an opportunity where certainly the positives of the Section 8 program should be brought to attention, because that is consistent payments coming from the federal government. Here in Indiana, we do have high denial rates for individuals who try to pay their rent with a voucher. That's something that we had issued a report on several years ago that's available on our reports page, and that we continue to try to educate the public on and draw attention to. So in my time here, I want to move on to the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition. That is something that was launched here officially recently, but really came to be in the fight against SEA 148 and before that SB 340, which we felt just simply went too far in changing the power structure between landlords and tenants. And the Fair Housing Center had advocated against the passage of those laws. And in response, in working with a number of our other partners, over 300 organizations ultimately ended up voicing their opposition to SEA 148. And we basically, a number of us who had been active at probably a higher level, particularly within the State House, wanted to really harness the energy of all those collaborations, because we knew that there might be other bills that might be coming back, or this was also around the time when we didn't know what COVID was going to end up being, where there might be other discussions that we might need to advocate on. So the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition was recently officially launched to work on COVID-related housing-based issues from a policy perspective, but we certainly would envision that there are other issues related to housing. And Andrew, I know, is going to talk about basically some of those guidelines, which includes trying to make sure that landlords who are trying to work with tenants also get relief as well. So we are very proud as the Fair Housing Center to be a member of the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition and look forward to trying to educate the public about housing-based needs and working to better those options and those opportunities through policy changes. And I will turn it back over to Andrew.
All right, thank you so much, Amy. And Carrie, let me know if we have any specific questions for Amy. If not yet, then we'll have an opportunity to have a group discussion here in just a moment.
No questions at this time, Andrew.
Okay, so next up, I want to introduce Dee Ross, who is the CEO and founder of the Ross Foundation. The Ross Foundation is focused on how we can invoke long-term change through effective programming to improve youth outcomes and access to basic needs and opportunities for economic growth for residents. I know that Dee has also founded the Ross Foundation's Tenants' Rights Union, and Dee is also a member of the steering committee of this new Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition. So welcome, Dee.
Hey, hello everyone. Can you all hear me?
I hear you just great.
All righty. So before I jump into what we do, I like to kind of jump into a couple stories, kind of give you guys some background about what we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And so just last year, Indianapolis was #2 in evictions behind New York City, and we are nowhere near being one of the largest populated cities, which clearly means that tenants are not just being evicted for not just paying their rent, and that Indiana is one of the poorest in law protection for the tenant. In our Black and brown communities, they are disproportionately catching the coronavirus and are unlawfully being kicked out of their homes.
Oh, Dee, I think we've lost your audio. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me now? Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So in our Black and brown communities, they are disproportionately catching the coronavirus and are unlawfully being kicked out of their homes and being taken advantage of. One story that stands out the most is witnessing an elderly Black mother being unlawfully put out of her home, catching the COVID-19 virus, and dying within 3 weeks here in Indianapolis. The next story, and this is currently happening as we speak, and our Tenants' Rights Union is fighting. There are 5 young boys who have been taken advantage of by their improper property management on the east side of Indianapolis. After the death of their mother, they have been taken advantage of by the property management company, who also gave them false information about their Section 8 Indianapolis housing benefits, which caused them to be kicked out of their program, has allowed them to live in an apartment filled with mold, water intrusion, and discoloration for over eight months. And now is trying to illegally evict them in the middle of a global pandemic. The property management told them on May 8th that they have until May 15th to vacate their home when they've been living there over 15 years. So the mission of the Ross Foundation Tenants' Rights Union is to create housing justice through empowerment-based education, outreach, leadership development, organizing, and advocacy. We want to create concrete improvements in tenants' living conditions and challenge and transform unjust housing policies and practices. Our work is grounded in the strong conviction that we must be boots on the ground. Tenants must be the leaders of efforts to transform our housing/apartments, conditions, and communities. We embrace the values of equality, hope, tenant leadership, respect, direct action, civic courage, racial and economic justice, and self-determination in our work. So in response to COVID-19 and the eviction moratorium, the Ross Foundation Tenants' Rights Union has hired tenant leaders in 20 different neighborhoods across the city of Indianapolis to serve as neighborhood tenant fellows in underserved communities over the next 3 months. This job would consist of going door to door under the CDC safety guidelines, educating their neighbors on their rights, connecting tenants to the proper resources and services to solve issues, providing sample letters, organizing all tenants collectively on a bi-weekly call, and informing them of all the local updates issued by executive orders. Our neighborhood tenant fellows will serve as the go-to contact person in their community and concerning any issue around housing. We found that many underserved communities just don't know where to go for help or have access to these type of resources. So this initiative could potentially not only keep tenants from being evicted, but also create jobs for the unemployed as well. And so us joining the statewide coalition went hand in hand with what the Ross Foundation mission is with the Tenants' Rights Union. And so being a part of that coalition, we are able to bring a different perspective from the tenants and making sure the tenants is included and involved and at the table when we're talking about changing legislation, policies, and laws. We're being intentional about including the stories of the tenants. And so that's basically all we do in a nutshell. And feel free to ask any questions.
Thanks so much, Dee, and thank you for bringing to light that, you know, some of the statistics that we're talking about aren't statistics, they're lives. And so what we're talking about has, you know, real life and death implications for some of the low-income residents, you know, and I know that you're based in Indianapolis, but these things are happening all throughout the state of Indiana. And that's why we've come together here. So Carrie, I don't know if we have any questions specifically for Dee. If not, we can move on and talk about some of the recommendations that the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition has come up with.
We do have one question here for Dee. It says, thank you so much for sharing. What should local officials do to make sure molded apartments aren't rentable?
Yes. Well, one suggestion I think we should do is, far as reaching out to HUD and where they get a lot of their funding from, you know, they shouldn't continue to be approved for Section 8 or, you know, low income housing if there's inhabitable living conditions in the first place. And so we must be intentional about targeting these apartment complexes as well that is receiving funding from federal dollars and making sure that they are up to the living conditions in the first place.
Thank you, Dee.
Okay, any other questions? Mm-hmm.
No other questions.
All right. Well, then let me make sure I want to talk briefly about provide a little bit more state level data, but I want to get into some of the recommendations that this new Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition has come up with. And the idea here is that we want to be able to put together federal, state, and local resources so that we can have a combined housing security response to this pandemic that will help us not just respond, but also have a come out better in recovery than we did before this pandemic. So Carrie, if you would, you could walk us through some of the slides that we have here. The slide that we have up right now is a snapshot. We wanted to make sure to emphasize, and we'll have this in the coming slide, that the COVID crisis is hitting Hoosier renters hard, not just in terms of homeowners, but also renters are being hit hard. And also we want to make sure that we note that Indiana could face a wave of evictions and homelessness after the moratorium is lifted on June 4th. A number of our presenters have talked about that. So in response to this, and as Amy mentioned, this Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition is trying to come up with that policy response. So we could go on to the next slide. So just to emphasize how hard this crisis is hitting Hoosier renters, we don't have all the data yet to be able to really dial down and understand exactly how it's hitting renters, in part because that moratorium is providing a needed backstop. But underneath that, there's a data point here that shows that nearly 400,000 of the 600,000 Hoosiers who have applied for employment are coming from low-income jobs. And these tend to be the types of jobs that are held by renters, and especially by Hoosiers of color and by women. We could go ahead to the next slide. This gives us another little data point. Yep, there's that one data point. We could go ahead and move on though, because we're starting to see a little bit of data coming from the state. The previous slide showed the types of patients that Hoosiers are facing job loss in. And you can see the largest piece there is actually manufacturing. That may come as a bit of a surprise, but manufacturing is seeing the largest initial job losses. But some of the other occupations that have been hardest hit are some of those that you can imagine coming from the stay-at-home orders. Food and beverage workers, people in hospitality, people in personal care services, and other service occupations are those who have really been hit by layoffs. And again, these are the same type of jobs that are typically held by renters. So this is helping to describe, these are the folks who have missed, now up to 6 or 8 paychecks in a row. And these are also folks who may or may not have received unemployment assistance. So come time for that June 4th lifting of the eviction pause, these are the folks that may not have the rent in order to pay all the back rent. We also know that nearly 40% of Hoosiers do not have even $400 saved up in emergency rental funds. And by that point, that's much more than the rent that will be owed. All right, we can go ahead and move forward. Next slide, please. So as Diane mentioned earlier before, they've done national, going back one slide, they've done a national survey of the number of folks that they estimate will need emergency rental assistance. In Indiana, that comes to 43,800 conservatively estimated as a potential surge in need for emergency rental assistance. And so that's kind of the universe that we're working with. We could expect an additional number of 43,800 who would need that type of assistance. So in order to tackle that, as Amy mentioned, this Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition was created out of the aftermath of the successful effort for to veto SCA 148, which now seems like a lifetime ago. This was just 2 months ago this week that this effort ended at the end of the General Assembly session, when a group of advocates came together to try to prevent additional eviction authority from being given to landlords. And this was really important at this critical juncture when we had this pandemic just happening. We could go ahead and move forward. Next slide, please. So building on that momentum, this group of advocates has come forward with a number of recommendations, and let's go ahead and talk about those in the next slide. So you can see these are the type of folks who have been part of the initial steering committee. Yeah, let's look at here. So this coalition has come together and has advocated, first of all, we recommend that Indiana extend that moratorium on evictions to match the end of the federal moratorium, which has been described at July 25th, or 60 days after the state public health emergency ends, whichever is longer. And at this point, with that public health emergency going to June 4th, that would be about the beginning of August for another 60 days. And the point here isn't just to keep kicking the can down the road. The reason that we've made that recommendation is that the state needs to use that time to create and implement a housing security response that includes emergency rental assistance. And earlier on this call, we were able to hear from LB that IHCDA is planning to come up with recommendations, but as part of that, there is a necessary comment period and hearing that will need additional time in order to put those that plan in place. And that's why we have that date set up. So let's go ahead and talk on the next slide about what we need to do with that time that we're buying. So the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition has put out a series of recommendations. You can find it on the blog of Prosperity Indiana. It's also been issued as a press release. We encouraged the Governor Holcomb to appoint a housing stability lead to coordinate state and local agency action, including Indiana's housing authorities and community development efforts. So what we're recommending is that there be a single point of contact and authority for a housing stability response. We want that to be able to coordinate all these different types of institutions that you see listed here who are already involved and necessarily involved in a housing stability response. Importantly, we think that this housing security lead should also be responsible for ensuring an equitable delivery of services among Hoosiers of colors and those in disproportionately impacted communities. We've already heard on this call about how certain populations have been affected by job loss, by eviction attempts, and homelessness communities throughout the state. So we can go on to the next slide. As part of this housing stability response, rental assistance is going to be something that is going to be needed. And we heard a little bit about how that's something that's being thought about. We've heard the state's emergency solutions grant communities of response are thinking about how to use those funds for rental assistance. Another part of the CARES Act, the Community Development Block Grant, has gone to certain cities throughout the state, entitlement communities, and we know of two in Columbus and in Evansville who are planning to use some of that CARES Act for housing security response for emergency rental assistance. But we know that the need for that doesn't stop at the city limits for these entitlement communities. And that's why we encourage there to be a statewide plan to be able to collect applications from renters in need and to be able to use different funding streams, whether they be from the CARES Act, from the future rental assistance that we're hoping Congress comes through with, or whether matching grants or other philanthropic grants related to certain communities. It's important, though, that the state have an accurate understanding of what the demand is for emergency rental assistance, and therefore be able to address that with additional funds as they come through in the future. You can also see here, we recommend that the state use existing nonprofit service provider organizations that are already out there, who are already equipped to be able to do intake and distribute resources used to screen applications and provide case management. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. A couple of other aspects of the recommendations that we've made already include providing ways to provide an equitable response. We're already looking right now in terms of the coalition. We're examining best practices from other states. We're seeing where other states have emergency rental assistance programs already functioning. What are the mechanisms that they're using in order to make sure that they're getting to the renters who are most in need, and also make sure that it's equitable in terms of having the entire renters from the entire state be able to apply for those funds. We also recommend market-based incentives to be provided to responsible landlords who commit to working with tenants and keeping them housed. These could include tax credits, it could include additional matching funds for those landlords, and we also want to support the efforts of those landlords by providing additional tools to courts to urge mediation and payment plans to avoid evictions. And I think this gets to a place where if we're once we reopen the ability for landlords to be able to file for evictions, as Brandon described earlier, we want to make sure that there's a support there for those who are working with tenants. So on to the next slide. So this leads us to, this is an ask that we have for folks out throughout the state. Prosperity Indiana has put an action alert on our page, on our action center, and this leads to the ask for rental assistance that Diane described before. As she mentioned, so far none of Indiana's congressional delegation has joined the 26 senators and over 130 House members to co-sponsor this new bill that's been introduced. And we really need not only to have support, but really champions from Indiana's congressional delegation on this front. As has been described, there is really high need in Indiana. The need in Indiana is no less than average across the country. Yet we need to match that need with representation from Indiana's congressional delegation. So I want to leave this slide up for now. And check in and see if we have any questions about the recommendations. And I'd like to invite Amy and Dee to participate in a few minutes of response in terms of why these recommendations are really needed. So Carrie, do we have any questions at this point?
We do. The first question is, how do you become a part of the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition?
That's a great question. And actually, I guess for that, we could go on to the next slide because it'll have the email address that you can use to join up. And basically that is HoosierHousingNeeds@prosperityindiana.org. And on this slide here is that action alert link as well. So right now we are just starting this up. We are hoping to have something like a logo and a larger landing page, but right now, if you want to get involved, that's the best way to reach out, and that way you'll be part of our future communications and the efforts that we have to try to bring this effort across the state.
Another question we have is, if a shelter will not allow a client into the shelter because they do not have PPE in place, is that discrimination for fair housing?
Amy, I'm going to let you take that if you are able to.
Thanks. So it may or may not be. The issues around whether or not somebody is being discriminated against in violation of fair housing laws because they may have COVID-19 or may be believed or perceived into potentially having COVID-19 is something that a lot of our legal experts are currently working through. Individuals with disabilities are protected under fair housing laws. We don't know quite yet if COVID-19 rises to the level of meeting the definition of disability under law, which is substantially limiting impairment. However, the disability definition under fair housing laws is written that people also can't be discriminated against for being perceived as having a disability. And that is the issue that is currently being debated. And we may get to a point where we're going to need to have some HUD guidance on whether or not the belief that somebody may be susceptible to COVID-19 or have COVID-19 rises to that perception level under disability or not. So this is an area where I don't have an answer for you right now. It's something that's being debated and looked at. I think that though in the interim here, that we would caution against people making perceptions or keeping people out of any sort of belief such as that.
And a final question, does the statewide website involve a single point of entry for multiple sources of help, such as state assistance, nonprofit service, or township trustee assistance?
That's an excellent question. And, again, at this point, we are proposing that the state create a website like this. It doesn't yet exist here in Indiana. From what I've seen, there's a couple of good examples. And actually, the National Low Income Housing Center does have a collection of these different rental assistance programs on their site. And I think we could follow up and include a link to that with some of the final slides. Some that I think that are promising so far are actually from Texas and from Arizona and from Montana. Those are three that I'm starting to look at in terms of statewide programs. In Texas, when renters go to that site, really the statewide site does allow them to put in the different types of assistance that folks are looking for. And when they're asking for short-term rental assistance, it really, it provides them with a number of local providers in their region who may have rental assistance. A downside to doing it that way, though, is that then you have, if you're counting on the regions to provide assistance, then you're limited to regional response. And I saw, for example, that Houston, when their municipal site went up recently, they received 16,000 applications right away. And I think that helped point to the reason why we need a state level response.
We have one question here, Andrew. Has there been a lot of help enforcement from the AG's office concerning the obvious violations?
Actually, I am not aware of what the level of complaints that have come into the AG's site. I assume, unless we happen to have Brandon still on the line who has any additional information, or if Amy does, that's something that I think it's kind of part of the delayed response that we've seen with this moratorium, is that we're at a point of we're collecting violations of the executive order. Dee spoke to that a little bit as well. We definitely have some examples of complaints, but we don't know, or at least I haven't seen what that looks like statewide.
Yeah, and this is Amy. At some point, we might want to do a public record to the AG's office to get an idea. I'm not certain what they can turn over. Having done some requests in the past to the AG's office, it's a little weird as to what information can and can't be released through public records requests, but it's something that I think that coalition should have on its radar to do at some point.
So Carrie, unless there were any last questions that have come in, let me take a moment and thank not just Amy and Dee, but also Brandon and LB and Diane. This turned out to be, we had a lot of information to share, and we could probably keep going for another 3 hours with all the different information that all of our groups have come up with. But I want to leave you with the recommendation to visit the websites that our presenters have given you, to reach out to Hoosier Housing Needs at Prosperity, Indiana, with next steps for how to get involved. And also, please take just a moment and visit that Action Center, because that's an immediate step. We need to get Indiana's congressional delegation on board as champions in this effort. So without any further ado, thanks everybody for joining us, and we look forward to continuing these conversations in the weeks and months to come.
Thank you everyone for participating today, and we just ask that you please join us next Monday, May 18th from 10 to 11 a.m. Aaron Slater with Intentional Coaching and Consulting will be our guest speaker, who will speak on the topic of leadership in times of stress, with a particular focus on team leadership. Again, thank you everyone for participating, and have a great week.